Welcome to Season 1, Episode 6 of the Table Podcast. This week, we see parallel stories of Cain and Abel show up further in Scripture. Today we'll be in 1 Samuel, visiting the story of David and Saul. And you'll hear from Tanner Moore, Brian Froese, David O'Brien, and Garrison Jones. Thanks for joining us at the table.
All right. Well, hey, welcome back for another round here in 1 Samuel. We got Ryan, got David, got Garrison, and we're going to be in 1 Samuel 24 right now together. Just as a quick recap, though, of where we've been, if you've been on this journey with us, we've been talking Cain and Abel. And we've been talking about, older brother, younger brother. And we've been talking about seeking God's favor and what kind of sacrifice God wants from me. We've seen people do it right. We've seen people do it wrong. We saw Hannah do it the right way. We saw Cain and Saul do it the wrong way. Saul makes this arrogant sacrifice, wanting God to owe him one. And God says that I've rejected you as king. And God goes and seeks someone. And he finds David, and God raises him up to become the next king, and sends Samuel to go and anoint David as king. Well, in the story, and if you're listening, read through the book of 1 Samuel. But if you're familiar with the story of David, David ends up working in Saul's court. He serves in the military, and he's a very successful general. He works in Saul's court. He ends up being best friends with Saul's son. He actually marries Saul's daughter. Saul becomes his father-in-law. And Saul doesn't know this whole time that Samuel has already anointed David to be the next king. But what Saul does know is that David is wildly popular. All the people love him. And Saul does not, because David has found favor in the eyes not just of God, but also of the people. And Saul doesn't have God's favor any longer. So Saul does what Cain does. He tries to kill David. David escapes, but Saul tries on multiple occasions to kill David, and he chases him out into the wilderness. And so as we pick up the story here in 1 Samuel 24, Saul has chased David out into the wilderness. He's got David cornered. David is basically trapped, and so David and kind of David's buddies and soldiers who are faithful to David are there in a cave, and here comes Saul and the army of Israel coming to take David. And that's where we pick up the story with the little brother who's found favor being pursued by the Cain figure in the story, ready to take his life. So let's pick up the story here in 1 Samuel 24. Why don't we start off here in, we'll start off in verse 1. Let's go through verse 13. How about, does that work? Perfect. If we can go verse 1 through 13. Ryan, why don't you read that for us?
Yeah, sure
time?
thing.
Verse 1 through 14. 13, excuse me.
1 through 13?
Yeah.
Verse 1. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Then David crept up unannounced and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Number 5. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, The Lord forbid that I do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went on his way. Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, My lord the king. When Saul looked behind him, David bowed and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, Why do you listen when the men say, David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at this piece of robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I am guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds, so my hands will not touch you. Is that it right there?
Yeah, let's stop right there. Okay, good. All right, so since we're on the theme of Cain and Abel, let's just kind of pick out a few of the Cain and Abel references here. Do you see any Cain and Abel moments pop up here in this part of our story?
There's a chance for revenge.
Yeah.
And in a murderous revenge. There's a chance and opportunity.
Yeah.
And maybe even a thought of it by David, I would say, for sure.
Yeah. And encouragement by his friends.
Yeah.
Right?
Get him.
Yeah. What do you think about this verse that they say, this is the date, God told you this day was coming, when he would deliver your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
What do you think about that?
Stood out to me the most.
Okay, how come?
Everything, like, just the fact, of course, Ryan, you read on, and yes, it makes sense. Even I've read this over and over, but that part right there, it's do with this as you will, but that's him being a man after God's own heart is showing right there.
Yeah.
From that moment.
Yeah.
He's given him that ability to do with, he could kill him right now.
Mm-hmm.
But he's remembering, I'm not going to touch God's anointed. That I'm being obedient. And I see that happening.
It's good.
Do you think that God is condoning David killing Saul, or is God giving David an opportunity? But does God want David to kill Saul here, do you think?
I'm going to say no.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, though, just the way that it's written, you almost think he would be justified. Like, God is giving him the opportunity, and God's saying you can if you want to. I don't know.
Maybe so. Or maybe God is telling David the same thing that he told Cain. Cain, this is your choice. I'm going to leave the ball in your court, Cain.
Yeah.
Sin crouches at your door. You have to master it. But it's your choice. I'll leave you with your choice. Maybe you're right, Ryan. Maybe God is giving David a chance to take Saul's life, and he's saying, okay, David, if you want it, you can have it. Here you go. Or maybe that's exactly what he's doing, and he's saying, okay, David, here's your chance. What's it going to be?
And you would say, to me, you would almost say that David would be completely justified. Because he's being, chased for a long time.
For a long time. Saul's already attempted murder multiple times and missed.
Hadn't been for Jonathan, he would be dead.
He would
be dead.
Yep,
and
you're right.
David doesn't know that it will end.
Sure.
Until he possibly dies. So he's kind of backed up in a corner.
Yeah.
Like Saul, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And he might be at that panic stage. Like, oh my goodness. Like, if I don't kill him, then maybe I will die.
Yeah.
Maybe I need to so that I can survive. I don't know.
Yeah.
But how much more powerful that he didn't.
Yeah.
Right? When we think about grace, when we think about forgiving somebody, like, it's so easy to hold a grudge, it's so easy to revenge, but how much more powerful is it to go to somebody and say, I forgive you, brother. I forgive you, sister.
Yeah.
Like, how much more powerful is that? Like, think about this story. And you know that Saul, man, it had to speak into his heart. Now he
Well,
continues
he
on.
leaves.
Yeah.
He leaves. He says, okay, David, you're right. Now, 2 chapters later, he's trying to kill him again.
Absolutely.
But for the moment, it makes him
Right.
leave and go home.
Right.
You're right.
Had an impact.
It did. It did. Even on a murderous king who's bent on using everything at his disposal to
Right.
take David's life. Yeah. It's kind of like, and I don't know, somebody said something about obedience is better than the outcome. And it's kind of like David knows that. Like the outcome would be good.
Yeah.
David gets to be king,
Yeah.
which that's what God wants. For David to be king. God's already commissioned his prophet to anoint David as king.
Yep.
And David knows that.
David knows that. It's not just that David wants to be king. God wants David to be king. The outcome is in David's hands, and he could rise up, take Saul's life, and become king, and he would be a shoo-in to be the king. It would be the correct outcome. But would David be living in accordance with the will of God? The God who created humans to make life and not death, the God who said in the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, would he be obeying? And wouldn't that be David doing the same thing that Saul did? Wouldn't he be going down the Saul path if he did that? Let's think about this for a moment and maybe even ask ourselves the question, so like, what does this mean for me? What does it mean for us in our lives here? I don't know. What about David here is speaking to you in his action?
May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me. I feel like David is, in a sense, forgiving and letting go of it. That's the moment out loud you can see that like I'm not letting this control me anymore.
Yeah.
That
I go back to your analogy of, putting your hands on your son's shoulders and saying, I just need you to trust me here. And I know you could go do that thing.
right.
And I can't stop you from doing it, but I need you to trust me.
Yeah.
How does this story here show David listening to God in trust?
Because he trusts that, he's been anointed.
That's right.
He trusts that God will handle when he becomes king. Because I'm sure, like in David's shoes, you would think, oh, golly, this guy's kind of terrible. He's doing some awful stuff. Like, God, when are you going to fix the situation? When are you going to make me be king, the way that you said that I would be?
Yeah.
But he's not making it happen by himself. He's not creating a sacrifice to make it happen.
That's right.
Well, and how many times in Psalms you say, how long, O Lord? How
True.
long,
Yes.
O Lord? I'm ready.
And
I'm
he struggled with
He
it.
struggled with it.
Absolutely did.
And again, how much more powerful that he did
Chapter to
this,
chapter. But didn't take it into his own hands.
Absolutely. It's such
He
a powerful.
let God handle it.
It's good. So good.
So let's compare David to Hannah. How does David handle this moment like Hannah handled it?
I think we've said this a lot, but I think it's really relevant. It's a theme, the posture of the heart. It's pouring out yourself to God and saying, God, I'm trusting you. That analogy again, or I'm trusting you. I'm pouring myself out for you. And whatever the outcome is, again, Hannah, her face was not downcast before she received her blessing. Same thing here with David. I'm trusting you, God. I know the blessing's coming whenever your time is. I think there's the posture of their heart seems much more geared toward God and not themselves and building up themselves. They're building up God.
I'm not going to vindicate myself. I'm going to let you do it. I'm not going to... I'm not going to try and deliver myself from the mess that I'm in. I'm going to let you deliver me. That's what I see him doing.
It's good.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily in this passage get as much of a visual into David's heart as you do whenever you read the Psalms that talk about him running from Saul. But just like Hannah, he's in anguish.
He is.
And he is like wrestling with it.
Yeah.
He's wrestling with what's going on with his trial.
That's right.
Just like Hannah was.
Yeah.
She was wrestling with her trial. And David is too. But just like Hannah, he leaves it in God's hands.
That's right.
While he has people telling him, just do it.
Yeah.
Just do it, man.
Yeah.
Watch out who your friends are.
No doubt. Goodness.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
So if your friends are telling you that you should kill this guy,
Everyone's doing it.
Yeah. Everyone's doing it. They deserve it.
I tell you, let's read some of those poems of
Okay.
David.
Yeah.
Some of the times when he is in that anguish place. And there are several Psalms that we can read that David is probably on the run from Saul.
Yeah.
Let's look at Psalm 7.
Okay.
Most likely when David is running from Saul here. And then one that's a kind of a famous one. We'll look at number 63 as well. How about Psalm 7 and Psalm 63? Man, I think that we're right on track with how David feels based on what we've said as we read this. So let's look at it. Garrison, why don't you read? Let's go Psalm 7. Let's just start off with the first 9 verses.
Okay. Psalm 7 says, O Lord, my God, I take refuge in you. Save and deliver me from all who pursue me. Or they will tear me like a lion and rip me to pieces with no one to rescue me. O Lord my God, if I have done this, and there is guilt on my hands, if I have done evil to him who is at peace with me, or without cause have robbed my foe, then let my enemy pursue and overtake me. Let him trample my life to the ground and make me sleep in the dust. Selah. Arise, O Lord, in your anger. Rise up against the rage of my enemies. Awake, my God, decree justice. Let the assembled peoples gather around you. Rule over them from on high. Let the Lord judge the peoples. Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness, according to my integrity, O Most High. O righteous God, who searches minds and hearts, bring an end the violence of the wicked, and make the righteous secure.
What do you see there in David's poem? How do you see David wrestling?
I'm trying to be good, God. When am I going to get my...
Uh-huh.
When am I going to see some fruit from what I've been doing? I mean, it's tough.
he must be pretty secure in his righteousness, though,
Yeah.
because he literally says, if I'm not, then let my enemy overtake me and trample me and kill me.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would say that if I was not feeling like I was on the right side.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
It's true.
Yeah, you think about maybe the conflict that you're in as a listener, or us at the table. If you're in a conflict and you say, I would come to God in prayer and say, God, I tell you what, if I'm in the wrong here, you just let that other person just overtake me and trample me down.
It's a bold prayer.
Yeah, I don't know if you're willing to do that one. You might have something to do with it. I might have something to do with it more than I'm willing to admit. But David knows. David couldn't pray that prayer had he taken Saul's life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could he? He couldn't have prayed that prayer.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I'm reminded of Paul and his encouragement in the New Testament when he says that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the evil powers of the world. How do you see David take that idea and apply it right here in his life? That my struggle is not against Saul, my struggle here is against evil, and I'm not going to give in to it.
I think you could say he's zooming out. He's rather than killing the one little flesh zoomed in that's trying to make him give in to the very same thing. He's zooming out and saying the greater good is to not take your life. The greater good is to continue my righteousness. So I think it's kind of a zooming out analogy there that he's allowed to see.
Yeah.
And maybe he understands the implications of how important this moment is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, we talked about Cain, the decision that he made and what happened with that.
Yeah. And David
Where
would have
it
been
went.
so familiar with that story,
Yeah, sure.
And he would be familiar with Hannah's story.
Yeah.
And what came of her decision,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's something he's thinking about. And
Yeah.
and the stakes are pretty high here. I mean, king of Israel.
Hmm.
You know, what kind of king are you going to be?
Yeah.
And what kind of impact are you going to make? Because obviously there's some dudes that came later, and, you know, David screwed up later too, but there's some people that came later. They had a very negative, lasting impact.
Most of them.
Yeah, most of them. Yeah.
You're right. You're right.
But we still look back on David's example so often, today even, you know, this far removed, and we look at his example and use it for me to draw on, you know, the right way to do things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I get real practical real fast?
Yeah, let's
So
do
let's
it.
ask the question. So how do we know? God has anointed David. You feel like God has anointed you to do something, but how do we know when the timing's right? How do we know as believers? How do we know as listeners? How do we know when it's right? How do we know what's right and when the right time is?
Yeah, great question. Anybody want to take that? I actually want to answer that with a question. And
Perfect.
My question back to you is, does it matter that we know?
That's a good question.
If God has anointed you for something, does it matter when the time?
That's right.
Or do you trust that if God's anointed you, if God has a calling on your life, he will see it done?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's where David's at.
It's good.
It doesn't matter when it comes. David knows God has anointed him and God will see it done.
It's good.
So how do we live that out? How do we live that ethic, and how do we live with that trust in God?
Right.
And have you ever had to live that trust in God in your life?
Yeah. It's good.
I think a lot of what I see, David go through is just there's fear that can sort of get out of control for good reason. I mean, your life is at stake, like you said, Ryan. There's a lot on the line here. This is not just about him. It's so much bigger.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be able to think properly, given I was in that circumstance. But there are times, real quick, I have felt that way, and I don't know. It's him, like you said, giving that fear over to him, and just he's got this.
Mm-hmm.
But it's walking forward in peace, knowing that.
Yeah.
But then when the next time happens, do it again.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
When everything's going good and all of a sudden the bottom drops out, let's do it again.
Wow.
I messed up
That's
big
good.
time. Let's do it again.
Yep.
And so
Regardless
that
of the outcome.
Yeah.
it's not a one-time thing. It's
good.
It's a lifelong
Continual.
choice. It's a
Yeah.
lifelong sacrifice.
yeah.
And wrestling, a lifelong wrestle.
And a
Absolutely.
wrestle.
Because
There it is.
And
David,
it's messy.
when David quit wrestling,
Yeah.
what happened? He let his eyes deceive. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a lifelong battle.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter. Sometimes the answer is no.
Yeah.
Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes you get what you want, or sometimes God just says no too.
Well, Paul, I've asked him to remove this thorn in my flesh, and he won't do it.
Yeah.
Wrestling.
Yeah.
As far as we know, he never did,
Yeah. Same thing.
and that's okay.
That's okay.
Uh-huh.
It's okay.
That's a good point. Yeah. And I love what you said there, David, about it being
Absolutely.
a consistent, it's a perpetual
Yeah.
surrender that you make to God and
good.
into obedience. And you don't get to obey once and call yourself obedient,
Right.
right? I imagine if your kid obeyed you one time, but the rest of the day didn't. At the end of the day, they said, "Dad, I've been a pretty good listener today. Shouldn't I get this
Some
extra
ice cream
candy?"
today? Yeah.
Yeah, and you're like, "No, you haven't. You listened to me one time."
10%.
That's not being a good. That's not being obedient.
But that's what we do.
Is
That's
it? Yeah.
exactly what we do.
It's right. Well, God,
But God, remember 3 years ago?
One thing.
Yeah, I did this wonderful thing for you. And,
Yeah.
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 Yeah. It's true.
You know, David is in the same spot that Cain is in, and he's got to make the choice. Is he going to? And it's almost as if God lets him be in that spot.
Yeah.
It's like God sets him up to be in that spot. And you could look at that as God trying to trip David up. I think it's the opposite. I think God is setting David up to demonstrate, this is my man. And I'm going to show everybody why I've chosen him, because look at how righteous he's going to act in this moment.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure this story gets told by the people that were around him.
Absolutely.
Everybody finds out, oh, hey, he could have taken the throne, and he didn't.
Yep.
Yeah.
The fact that, sorry.
No, go ahead. No, you're good.
The fact that Saul looked the part
Mhm.
in the beginning, he was big, he would be that personality, but in the end, little shepherd boy, youngest in the family, he's being that. And it's completely opposite. It doesn't look, visually,
Yeah.
Mhm.
it's not looking the same at all, but yeah.
You're
I
telling
agree.
me
he's giving
I
them
have a
the
chance.
opportunity. So you're telling me there's a chance.
Exactly.
Yeah, I guess.
I think going back to what Tanner said about God allowing him to be this opportunity, I think there's a difference with a testing and tempting. I've always said testing, the hoped for outcome is positive. Tempting, the hoped for outcome is negative.
Good.
And so I think we could say God is testing him
Yeah.
with the
Yeah.
hopeful outcome that you
Yeah.
can demonstrate how righteous you are and why you're going to be the anointed
The
king.
king, yeah.
It's not a temptation of, I hope you kill that guy.
Yeah.
It's a
Right.
testing of, I want to give you the chance to show how righteous
Yes.
I am through you type thing.
Yeah.
Kind of going back to what
God
you
doesn't
said.
tempt.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, test
Yes.
for positive outcomes.
That's right.
But no negative temptations.
Yeah.
You know.
And so let's ask, for just the average layperson who attends First Baptist Church Seminole, what does it look like in your everyday life to be like Hannah, to be like David? Because we all, like we've said, we all end up in that Cain and Abel spot where our face is downcast, or where we don't have the favor we were seeking, or maybe someone else has the thing that we want. We're in a mode of comparison. We all end up in that moment where sin crouches at the door and it's knocking and it wants us. How does just the average person who lives in Seminole, Texas, be like Hannah, be like David in these moments, rather than be like Cain or be like Saul? What does that look like for us?
I think for me, because over the Christmas break, I've sort of been dealing with some of this exact. I'm not looking to kill anybody. That's not what I'm saying, but I've been dealing with just certain things that I need to. I've been wrestling with, but there's bitterness. It's not towards anybody. It's just circumstantial stuff, right? A year from now, is that really going to matter? Probably not. But again, I get in a conversation with my sister or family member, somebody, and then I was met with, David, that's not what matters. And just for me, just being able to listen and being able, that was not the answer I wanted to hear in the moment, but it was right. And the more I've said on it, the more I've thought about it, it's closed my mouth. Now, stop talking so much and just listen for a second. I think it's stop having your, like, man, if this would just, I want to do it this way, just listen, just trust. And that is so much easier said than done.
Yeah, what else? Good, David. Thanks for sharing that. What else?
I just think of, we kind of started off the whole thing talking about the sin of comparison. And, kind of where our society is and how our society has this idea now of for you to live out your truth.
Yeah.
And it's almost like that's a half-truth. Because nobody, I don't think there's anybody sitting here that can tell you, Garrison, what your truth is and how you need to live that out. Only you can do that for yourself. And that's kind of a twisted way of where our society is. Because our society says, well, you can live your own truth. But in a way that is almost true, it's just twisted a little bit. You understand what I'm saying?
I do.
You can, but at what cost?
Like
God does want Cain to bring his sacrifice.
Yes.
It is Cain's job to do Cain.
but only Cain knows.
That's right.
And only Cain knows if he's living out the truth.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Again, like we talked about before, you can look at someone's fruit and say they are not, but that doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Because only I know if I'm truly living for God or not.
Mm.
And nobody else can tell me that.
Yeah.
And so that's why I was saying that about our society, because our society is like, only I can live my own truth. The only problem is we're living for ourselves.
Yeah. We get to define truth.
Right.
Based on our society,
Exactly.
we get to both be the author and judge of truth.
Right.
And that's not how it goes. God gets to be the author of truth. We have to judge if we're living in accordance with
Exactly.
God's truth.
Exactly.
And so I do see the half truth there, because it is our responsibility to decide whether or not we're living in accordance with truth. And no one else can do that for us. But what truth are we listening to? Are we going to try to be the author of truth? Or, like we've been talking about, are we going to trust the real author of truth
Exactly.
and then try to align ourselves with it?
Right.
Yeah, great point. That's good.
I think kind of going back to your question, how do we react like Hannah? How do we react like David rather than like Cain?
Yeah.
Rather than like Saul? It's not easy.
Yeah.
But I think the first thing is we have to recognize when something's crouching. We have to recognize our temptation. We have to recognize where we're vulnerable. Jesus Christ goes toe-to-toe to Satan. He's been fasting for 40 days. What's the first thing Satan comes at him with?
Food.
Where he'd be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I think we have to recognize, where am I vulnerable? Where maybe should I avoid? What things should I do that will help me battle? And then I think we laughed at it, but laughing at David's friend saying, get him,
Yeah.
We surround ourselves with people that can encourage us. They can hold us accountable. They can sharpen us. And so when you are face to face with whatever it is you're vulnerable with, I can call Ryan and say, hey, I'm struggling. Can you pray for me? Or whatever it is, and so I think that's a step that we can take. Again, it ain't easy and we're going to fail, but I think it's recognizing, when sin is crouching at your door and developing strategies that help you avoid those places as much as possible.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, great point. Great point. I'm just so inspired by the stories here that we've read tonight of Hannah and of David, and the way that they wrestled with the sin that crouched, with their own emotion, the way that they wrestled with that pain and with the comparison. And I'm thinking back to the story of Cain and Abel. And I'm thinking about how God wanted Cain to have done that. But I just keep coming back to this idea of the life of Hannah and the life of David was not perfect, right? They did it the right way, but it was still messy. That really stood out to me as we studied today, because I hadn't really considered that yet. And I think that oftentimes we're presented with this picture of these heroes of the faith, of David and Hannah, and these people who were faithful to God's commands. And we almost get this picture of these perfect angels who had no struggle, and they simply were peaceful creatures who accepted every lot that God, that every fate that came upon them, with no temptation to struggle. And if I can't do it that way, I'm just not as good. Yeah. And that's just not the truth. When we really read the scriptures, what we see are real people with real problems who, in a very messy and rarely pretty way, fight to obey God. And they just surrender to obedience, trusting the idea that, like we've talked about, if God has called me to it, God will get me to it.
Yeah.
And so I think that for all of us, we can be encouraged to, as you listen, hopefully in your life, is that God has called you to something. Like, what is it that God has anointed you to be? What is it that God's called all of us to bring a sacrifice, right? And you listening right now, God's called you to offer that sacrifice. So you are called to something, but if you're called to something and you obey, God will see that it is done. God is the one driving.
Right.
Right. God is the one directing.
Yeah.
God is the one orchestrating. Your job is to obey. And when you do, regardless of the outcome, like you've talked about, Ryan, we can be like Hannah, leaving the moment with our face no longer downcast before the outcome has even arrived. Trusting that God will see it done. Yeah, go ahead, and then I'll close this with a final thought.
It just makes me think, like, you know, because again we've talked about that phrase, obedience being greater than the outcome. Hannah was satisfied before she had her child.
Right.
Yeah.
And what I've learned is that whenever I say yes to the call on my life, that's where you find God's favor, but also get that joy.
Yeah.
It's not from all of the other stuff.
Yeah.
It's the obedience, and just I don't know. That's what I think, and that's what I think about, like with my life.
Yeah.
The greatest joy that I have has come from just saying yes and being obedient to that call, and you can run away from it.
Yeah, you can.
And I've spent time running away from it, so I know what it feels like to run away from that call that God has put on your life, and then also know what it feels like whenever you finally just, I guess, give in and give yourself up to that call, and it is always better that
And
way.
I think it's worth noting, it's really important that when we find God's favor, it doesn't mean no temptation. It doesn't mean no storms. You look at the Virgin Mary, you who are highly favored, then her husband is fixing to divorce her. She absolutely faced all kinds of backlash for what happened to her.
Absolutely.
I mean, all kinds of, look
Can't
at David,
imagine.
highly favored, anointed. Saul tries to kill him over and over. And so I think sometimes we get this thing that, God, if I'm chosen by you, then why am I facing all this? And it's scriptural.
Yeah.
Look at Jesus Christ, his own son,
Yeah.
So something to keep in mind, I think, is important.
Yeah. And so if I could wrap us up, I actually want to close us with a thought from a part in the Bible that is not maybe related to the Cain and Abel story, but is related to David. And it's how did David even get there? How was he even born? And you have to back up the story into the previous book, and about 4 generations. And you meet this Moabite widow whose name is Ruth, who decides that out of loyalty and obedience, she is going to go to her death with her mother-in-law so that her mother-in-law won't have to die alone.
Yeah.
So Ruth leaves her home and she sojourns as a foreigner and an immigrant to Israel, knowing that what waits her is death, starvation.
Yeah.
But she meets this guy named Boaz who gives her this blessing. He says, may God show you the same chesed, the same loving loyalty that you have shown to Naomi. And God does. And God takes this obedient heart, this loyal, loving obedience in the form of a Moabite widow, and he finds a way to orchestrate this plan of redemption so that not only is she rescued and doesn't die, but she has a family. And she has a son, and they name him Obed. And then Obed has a son, and they name him Jesse. And then Jesse has a son that they name David, who becomes king of Israel. And when we trust in God and we obey, when we trust that the obedience is greater than the outcome, oftentimes those outcomes that we think are the bad outcomes, God might be using them 4 generations down the road to bring about something that we couldn't have even predicted.
Yeah.
All Ruth wants is to make it to the next meal. God knows that he's raising up a king from her. You never know when your obedience will impact your world today, but you won't even see the fruit of your obedience to God. Ruth was dead before David became king. She had no idea that her loyalty would result in the blessing of a nation, in the birth of Jesus,
Yeah.
who comes from David's line, because of Ruth's obedience. And so I just encourage you once again, God does not mismanage resources. And the greatest resource that God has to use is your obedient heart. And if you'll be like Hannah and be like David when you're faced with that temptation and decide to master it, God will find a way to turn it into something that is greater than you could ask or imagine. And that's the good fruit that we have to share with the world.
That's awesome. That's good.
Thanks for listening to FBC Seminoles, The Table Podcast. A new episode will be released each Monday. We invite you to pull up a chair and join our table each week as we dig into God's Word together. We would love for you to join one of our Connect groups that meets throughout the week and worship with us on Sunday mornings at 9 or 10:30. If you'd like more information, you can call our church office at 432-758-3291 or visit our website at fbcseminole.org.